All right, chapter 3. Here we go. Now, I hope you've already read the chapter, right? Remember, these videos are intended to supplement but not substitute for the chapter reading. So if you haven't read the chapter, just pause right here, go and read the chapter. It'll take an hour or two, and then come back and watch the video. What you read in chapter 3 is really the story of the growth and development of the English colonies, and the English colonies grow tremendously in this almost century between 1660 and 1750. At the beginning, in the middle of the 1600s, they're really just kind of fringe outposts with a few hundred people, maybe a few thousand people in the largest places. On the fringes of what is a very minuscule British Empire. I mean, the British are fighting amongst themselves. They're fighting with other European nations. They are not the British Empire that they were later to become. But by 1750, the British really are the strongest country in the world. It is a British Empire. And the colonies are prosperous and populous and powerful cogs in this economic juggernaut that is the British Empire. And so this chapter sort of explores the development and the growth and the diversity of the English colonies, which was in stark contrast to the Spanish and French colonization efforts, as well as the Dutch. I mean, the Dutch are there for a while, and as we read, the English conquer New Netherlands in the 1660s, and that's kind of it for the Dutch in America. The Spanish are in Central America and what's now the southwest of the United States, but their colonies do not grow anywhere close to the size and the scope of the English colonies. It's really quite amazing to see, and so this chapter explores how that happens. And as you read, it's not an easy process, right? We talked before about how there was no strategic plan. There was no overarching vision to guide English colonization. It was an ad hoc process. It was a process of experimentation, of trying this, trying that, kind of feeling colonists in various places feeling their way around and adjusting to local circumstances. And you'll read a lot of that. And one of the things that really is different about English colonization and what helps explain the United States that we live in today is the diversity from the beginning. I mean, there's a great map on page 115 of your book which shows the tremendous diversity of the population in the colonies. I mean, it really is quite extraordinary if you look. So I mean, you've got the English, of course. You've got the French. The French colonization is really concentrated along the St. Lawrence River and what's now Canada, but all through the English colonies. By 1760, you've got Frenchmen, you've got Germans, you've got Dutch, you've got Africans, you've got Scots-Irish, you've got Highland Scots, you've got Jews, you've got Swedes, you've got even Welsh and French Huguenots. I mean, there are all kinds of people coming to the English colonies along the Atlantic coast, really in search of freedom, of what became known as English liberty. And so as you're reading through this, you want to imagine what's going on in this process. I mean, it's a process of growth and development, people coming, staking their claim in a place they don't know. And over time, what happens is that these colonies become tremendously important to the British Empire. The Brits base their empire on trade. Really read that section on mercantilism carefully, because mercantilism, in some ways is the antecedent to our modern emphasis on free trade. But this idea that the colonies should serve as resources for the mother country. The colonies should provide raw materials. The colonies should provide markets for finished goods. That the colonies should play a big economic role for the mother country, and they do over time. Not in 1650 they don't, but by 1750 they certainly do. And so, as you're reading, you want to see these patterns of growth and development. Of course, as you grow, as different people come in, along with diversity, often comes tension. You have tension among different ethnic groups, people with different backgrounds. Certainly the English and the Indians have all kinds of conflicts. You have dissension within religious among religious groups. You have class tensions going on because, as Foner explains, during the 18th century, there's more and more economic inequality. So you see a wealthy, moneyed elite, the land-owning elite, really pulling away from the rest of society, in part based on the advantages they got early on, right? If you come in and you're granted 10,000, 20,000 acres, you very quickly become a wealthy person, who's able to dominate local affairs, and you don't have to spend your time eking out a subsistence living. So you can spend time thinking about larger issues, exerting public leadership, and so forth. And so you do see the creation of different classes where there are extremes of wealth and poverty, but you also get this mass of middle-class small landowners, which is very unusual, not just in terms of North American colonization efforts, but also worldwide. Certainly compared to England. Many, many more people own land in America than they did back in England, or the percentage was much, much higher. What this does is it provides a certain equal basis for what later becomes known as English liberty. And along with the rise of English liberty and freedom comes the rise, of course, of slavery. And that's what I'm going to spend most of the rest of the time talking about today. It's just so we have a really good sense of how slavery developed, and also how central it was to the economic system of the English colonies. Slavery isn't just a peripheral kind of thing, or just kind of developed on the side here. This was central to the development of the English colonies, and to the prosperity of the English colonies, and, as we'll see, to the rise of freedom for white colonists. So we need to talk in depth about slavery. I want you to read those sections carefully. The first paragraph where Foner talks about slavery is really important. The origins of American slavery. It starts on page 101 in your book, and I want to kind of go through that first paragraph real carefully, because he's bringing a lot of ideas here together. First, he says, no European nation, including England, embarked on the colonization of the New World with the intention of relying on African slaves for the bulk of its labor force. And that makes sense. Right? They didn't start out thinking they were going to enslave people. Not only did it violate certain notions of freedom that British people thought that they were bringing to the New World, but it also didn't make economic sense for a long time. Slavery had been practiced all over the world, but it didn't seem to make economic sense to go all the way to Africa. That's a long voyage, a very expensive voyage, and then have to deal with African kingdoms to try to procure slaves and then bring them all the way back over. A lot of them would die on the way because it's a very unhealthy voyage, and get them here and then work them. It's a very unhealthy area. The slaves would die, and then that's your investment gone. So it didn't make economic sense for a long time, and so it takes many decades for the system to develop. But the incessant demand for workers, it's the demand. Again, this is an economic system. The incessant demand for workers, spurred by the spread of tobacco cultivation, eventually led Chesapeake planters to turn to the transatlantic trade in slaves. And really what they're doing is they're following the pattern set by sugar planters in the West Indies. I mean, sugar, if you want to understand the rise of slavery, you really have to understand sugar in the Caribbean, because sugar was the first mass-marketed crop. And it required large teams of laborers to do backbreaking work in very difficult climates, and that was the first area where plantation slavery takes root. So the Chesapeake planters, when they find tobacco and are able to start marketing tobacco and find how profitable it is, and they realize that they just need more and more workers, they look to the Caribbean for an example. The slave trade had already been established down there, and so the Chesapeake planters are looking at the Caribbean for examples. Compared with indentured servants, slaves offered planters many advantages. As Africans, they could not claim the protections of English common law, right? So all those protections, that all those ideas bound up in English liberty, those are for English citizens, for Englishmen, not for Africans or Indians for that matter. Slaves' term of service never expired. Worked them until they died. And they therefore did not become a population of unruly, landless men. And this is going to become important. We're going to talk about this more with Nathaniel Bacon when we read Bacon's piece in the next video. Their children were slaves, and their skin color made it more difficult for them to escape into the surrounding society. Right? Skin color was key. And what we're going to see is they're going to change the laws. They're basically going to turn centuries of common law practice on its head by saying, one's status in society comes through the mother rather than through the father. That way, children of slave mothers and their master fathers would become slaves rather than free. African men, moreover, unlike their Native American counterparts, were accustomed to intensive agricultural labor, and they had encountered many of the diseases in Europe and had developed a resistance to them. So they were less likely to succumb to epidemics. We're going to talk about these ideas in more depth here. But again, what happens over the course of the late 17th century is that these economic advantages accumulate. And so planters start to see the economic logic of using slaves as opposed to using African slaves, as opposed to using Indian slaves or indentured servants for the labor that they needed for their tobacco crops. So, again, I can't stress enough that this is an economic system, and this becomes central to how the entire British Empire, the entire British North America, operates. Right? It's not just in the South. I mean, it takes deepest root in the South, but it's not just in the South. Right? Much of what English North America is, much of what they produce and they profit from comes from slavery. And we're going to talk a lot more about that even in the next chapter. But I also want to emphasize something else, and that is something we talked about the first day, which is contingency. Right? Historical events aren't inevitable in the way that the weather is. Right? And the imposition of race-based hereditary slavery was not inevitable. It didn't have to happen. It wasn't foreordained. It happened because of certain things and certain choices that were made. So in the middle of the 1600s, in 1650, the status of blacks in the English colonies is really uncertain. It's a matter of debate. There was a spectrum, in fact, of possibilities. Blacks could be slaves. Blacks could be free. Blacks could be indentured servants. It wasn't clear as of 1650 what the long-term status of black people in America was going to be. And I want to tell the story. It's not in the Foner book, but I want to tell the story of a woman named Elizabeth Key, who had a court case in 1656 that was really telling about the status of black people in America. So Elizabeth, they called her Bess, was 25 years old, a slave. She was the daughter of her master, not an uncommon occurrence. And her master dies. They live in Virginia. And her master dies, and she sues for her freedom. And she makes three arguments, basically. She says, first of all, I am the daughter of a free man, a free white man, and therefore I should be free, right? Because in general, your status would follow your father rather than your mother. Second, I'm a baptized Christian, and Christians should not be slaves, therefore I should be free. And third, I'm really an indentured servant, not a slave. I've already completed my term of service, therefore I should be entitled to my freedom. She sues in a Virginia court. The verdict, yes, you're right. Elizabeth should be free, is how they say it. And so the local jury accepted Key's argument, pronounced her free. The general court, basically the appeals court, steps in, overturns the verdict, but then the Virginia General Assembly steps in and overturns the general court, declares that Elizabeth is free, and not only that, she gets back pay to boot. Right? So here we are in 1656, the Virginia Assembly declares that a black woman, daughter of a slave mother and a white slave owner, should be free. So that kind of highlights that in the middle of the 17th century, we're still not sure. There are laws being passed kind of separating black people and white people, saying, well, you can't marry, but it's still kind of uncertain. And during the course of the late 17th century, a terrible transformation happens. It's what historian Peter Wood calls the terrible transformation from this kind of uncertain time when blacks could get their freedom, blacks could own land. In some places they could marry and sue white people in court and so forth. By the end of that century, by the late 1600s, early 1700s, the debate's over pretty much. Slavery is written into law, and pretty much if you were black, you were slaves. You were a slave. I mean, there are going to be free blacks even in southern communities and especially northern communities, but that population is always very small. And in general, there's an idea that if you are black, you are a slave in this society. So the question is, well, why? What causes this terrible transformation? Why do we move from this period in the mid-1600s where there's a lot of uncertainty and fluidity, where white people are indentured servants by and large, and blacks can be anything? How do we move from that to race-based hereditary slavery? And one thing is to look at the economic context of what's going on in the English colonies. I mean, by the 1660s, 1670s, the promise that Richard Hakluyt was talking about, this land of abundance, this place where we can send our poor and they'll become small farmers, land owning, productive farmers. That's kind of diminishing, because what's happened is that basically the rich folks have taken up all the good land, and the only land that's still out there is land that's either claimed by Indians or far from rivers, and it's just not good land. And so that, combined with overworked land, because tobacco production in particular is very hard on the soil, so you have overworked land, overproduction, you have overpriced tobacco, because here you are producing tons and tons and tons of tobacco. Price goes down. This leads to an economic crisis in British North America, particularly in Virginia. That's going to lead to Bacon's Rebellion. Again, Bacon's Rebellion, it's hard to overstate the importance of Bacon's Rebellion. That's why we're going to spend a whole video talking about Bacon's Rebellion. But Bacon's Rebellion, combined, in part is caused by these economic changes in the 1660s and 70s, helps to accelerate the shift from indentured servitude to race-based hereditary slavery. So the question is, why did they shift from the alternatives to African slaves? Why was it that indentured servants or enslaved Indians wouldn't do the job that the planters wanted done? So let's talk about the Indians first. We talked about that briefly in class, and just to go over again, it's like, well, the Indians are right there. Why not just capture them and put them to work? That's pretty much what the Spanish were doing down in Central America, was using Indians as slave labor or forced labor. But the problem was, and the Spanish encountered it too, was, first of all, they knew the land better than the colonists did, so they could escape relatively easily. They were too susceptible to European diseases, so they're going to die off, making it very, very difficult to base your economic system on their labor. And by the 1660s, local tribes, certainly surrounding the British colonies, are decimated. They're gone. They've either been wiped out by epidemics, or they've been pushed so far west that it's impractical to try to capture them and bring them back. So Indians are not a great alternative. But what about indentured servants? Remember that was kind of the idea, right? You bring these poor souls from England who are suffering in the slums of London. You bring them over. They work for 7 years or so, and then they get they become free, get their own land, and go off to settle the backcountry. Well, part of the problem is that there are too few of them, right? There are just not enough English workers willing to make that journey anymore, especially when there are other places that they could go. And this is where William Penn's holy experiment up in Pennsylvania becomes so ironically interesting, right? And actually, that's question number one that I want you to write about in your book is to describe the Holy Experiment, William Penn's Holy Experiment in Pennsylvania. What is he doing up there? How is it different from the other colonies? And how does it affect indentured servants in Virginia and Maryland? Because what happens is, so that's question number one. Describe William Penn's Holy Experiment up in Pennsylvania. What makes it different from other colonies? And how does it affect indentured servitude elsewhere, particularly in the South? Because Foner talks about that, and it's one of these things where it happens a lot in history, right? There are unintended consequences. You start out hoping for one thing, and you do it, and then something else unexpected and unwanted often happens. Because what happens is more indentured servants. If you're an indentured servant in England, where are you going to go? You're going to go to the place where you think you can have the most freedom, where you think you're going to be treated the best. And by the mid-1600s, late 1600s, that seems to be Pennsylvania, certainly more so than Virginia or Maryland. So that's one reason why indentured servants become less and less of a good economic option for planters and seeking laborers. Next, the work is just too demanding. Or excuse me, the indentured servants are too demanding. Right? They come to the work, they come to America seeking freedom with notions of English liberty in their heads. And so when they finish their term, they call them their freedom dues, which meant clothes, which meant money, and which meant land. Right? So after 7 years, yes, you can work them for 7 years, but then you've got to pay them a huge chunk of money or find land for them to go settle elsewhere. That's a lot. It seemed like too much to demand of their employers. So planters are, again, looking elsewhere. The other part of those freedom dues is that those indentured servants who become free, what do? Well, they go and they set up their own tobacco farms. And so they then become competition for the planters. So in effect, you're breeding your own competition by bringing these indentured servants over. They work their term, they go and they get their own land, and then they start producing tobacco too. We already have overproduction in the area. Tobacco prices are already lower than planters want them to be. And every year you're churning out more and more of these future tobacco farmers. That doesn't make economic sense either. And finally, it's getting too healthy in Virginia. At the beginning of settlement, you remember in Jamestown, people are dying. 50% of the colonists in Jamestown die right away. And for the early decades, the Chesapeake and Maryland, southern colonies, especially the Carolinas, these were terribly unhealthy places. You had malaria, you had all kinds of diseases, even just among the colonists, let alone for the Indians. And so the death rate was very, very high. So a lot of times you'd bring an indentured servant in, they might work 3 or 4 years and then they'd be dead. And you would never have to pay those freedom dues anyway. And if you brought a slave, they would die too. So it didn't make sense to invest in a slave. It was going to be much more expensive. So as the health improves, the health climate improves, indentured servants become relatively more expensive. So what do if you're a planter, a Virginia planter? You look for another source of low-cost labor. And that's where the African slave trade, which is booming in the Caribbean, seems to make more and more sense. Why? Well, the Africans don't know the land. They can't run away the way the Indians can. If they do, they're going to be conspicuous. People will be able to find them very, very easily. They were also able to survive in the warm climate. They resisted European diseases. There seemed to be an endless supply of them back in Africa. Right? It was just thousands and thousands and thousands coming to the New World every year. They also wouldn't become future competitors. Right? Unlike indentured servants, their term never expires. And so they're never going to get their freedom dues. They're never going to get their own land. They're never going to become tobacco farmers on their own. And so they will never become competition. And as the life expectancy grows, the slave's term of service grows. It's not fixed the way an indentured servant was, at usually around 7 years. As slaves live longer and longer and longer, that term of service could be 30, 40, 50 years, right? And so slavery becomes tremendously profitable for Virginia farmers, and they turn, not all at once, not, again, it's not like a conspiracy or anything, but over the course of several decades, more and more planters start to see slaves as a better economic option than indentured servants, and certainly more than Indians, enslaved Indians. And so that's the second question, would be to describe or explain the development of slavery in British North America. How was slavery established? Why did planters turn to slavery? So that's question number 2 for your homework. And the third question that I want you to think about is, we've been talking from the beginning about the seeming paradox, the paradox at the heart of early American history, which is, how did freedom and slavery rise together? They grew simultaneously. And so the question, my third question would be that many British settlers, British colonists in America, said that this was the best poor man's country in the world, right? And that the people, the white people who lived there, were the freest in the world. So I want you to explain what factors would lead them to say that. What factors in British North America, this is going to be in your textbook, led many people, many settlers especially, to say this was the best poor man's country. Here we can be more free than anywhere else in the country, or anywhere else in the world, excuse me. What factors would lead them to say that? Because question number 2 talks about slavery, right? We're talking about the rise of slavery, but we also have the rise of freedom. People feel and are much freer, white people at least, much freer than they could have been back in England or back in Germany and other places that they're emigrating from. What is it that's making them free? And we're going to talk in the next video about Bacon's Rebellion about how these two things are intertwined. Okay, so that's your third question there. And then the fourth question that I want you to do is, I want you to find an image. Go back in the textbook and find an image that you think is particularly compelling or particularly interesting. And I want you to describe what's going on in that image, or it might be a map. Okay, and explain what that image tells us about life in colonial British America. What made that image so compelling to you? There are a number of great images in here. So pick one that's of interest to you. Describe it. Describe what it shows about life in British America in the late 1600s, early 1700s. Now we're going to move on to the next video about Nathaniel Bacon and his rebellion, which helps kind of tie together the rise of freedom on the one hand and the rise of slavery on the other.